Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this very thought-provoking conference, and also for inviting me to discuss James Heckman's work. I followed his work for years now, particularly this latest thread, and even though I've read quite a bit of it in the past, I never had a chance to discuss it, so I'm delighted to be able to discuss it. And I'm particularly happy to be able to discuss it in this kind of venue rather than in an academic venue. The reason is in an academic venue, I would be expected to critique his methodology and to raise questions about his work. That is very difficult to do because his work is impeccable. So you've heard the new results he's presented, but what you haven't heard is all of the new methods he's presented to the literature. And there are many, many researchers who build on his methods because he's able to give us such definitive results. And so it's a pleasure to be able to just amplify on the results that he's given you. So just to review, he's basically shown us in this whole body of work that if we want to talk about inequality in wages and inequality in income, really what we need to talk about is inequality in skills, both cognitive and non-cognitive. And if we want to think about inequality in skills, we've got to think about what's happening very early in life. As I mentioned, the skills he also talks about is cognitive and non-cognitive, and perhaps, I mean, he's had many, many contributions from this literature, but perhaps the most important was moving the rest of the profession from thinking just about cognitive skills and recognizing the importance of all these other skills such as self-discipline, perseverance, all the sorts of things that people had overlooked when they only looked at IQ tests. So what I'm going to do in my discussion is amplify on three sorts of things and talk about some other research there. First of all, he gave you a graph that started at age 0 and went up. I'm going to go to the negatives. I'm going to talk about the first 9 months and how important those are. This is just amplifying on his research, but I'm going to show you some additional results there that are just coming out of the literature. Second, I'm going to talk about the importance of mother's behavior and the potential for interventions in ways that we can sort of help the family and help children's cognitive development. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about family investments of time in skill formation. And I'm going to talk about differences across races, but it's going to have a very different focus than what you might think given his previous research. Okay, the first 9 months really matter is what we're starting to see out of the literature. So there is a strong correlation between birth weight and later earnings. This graph is from Janet Curry's 2011 Eli lecture. The horizontal axis gives you the birth weight. This one is in pounds. I can't convert in my head to grams. And on the vertical is the mean earnings at age 24 to 27. Now, this correlation is as strong as the correlation if I instead put, say, 8th grade test scores on the horizontal axis. So what's happening in terms of the birth weight is correlated with what's going on with earnings when they're young adults. But is it correlation or causality, right? It could be, say, less educated mothers do things during pregnancy that lead to low birth rates, but it's really what they're doing in terms of the vocabulary they use, some of the things that Professor Heckman has talked about. Well, we have studies coming up that are suggesting that there is a causative effect of things going on when the mother's pregnant on children's later outcomes. So, for example, there was a study recently about the effect of the radiation from Chernobyl on Sweden. So the radiation levels there were detected, but they were considered to be below the harmful threshold. Well, researchers such as Doug Allman went and looked at the various areas in Sweden according to how much radiation hit there, looked at who was in utero at the time, looked at them when they were older in terms of test scores, compared them to children who were slightly older and slightly younger, and found significant negative effects on their later test scores because they'd been exposed to radiation in utero. Other studies have looked at the effect of the Chinese famine from 1959 to 1961. There again, if you were unlucky enough to be in utero rather than just, say, a young child during the Chinese famine, you were much more likely to be illiterate as an adult. The influenza epidemic of 1918. If you were unlucky enough to be in utero during this influenza epidemic relative to people just slightly older or just slightly younger than you, you had lower wages as an adult. Okay, so we're seeing much evidence that there's a causative effect of what's going on in utero on later life outcomes. So let's look, so some of the Heckman evidence looked at, say, wage differentials by race. Well, given what we see of the potential importance of low birth weight, let's look at the percent of babies that are low birth weight. So the first graph, the first bar is Asian, if you can't see it, the second is black, the third is Hispanic, and the fourth is white, okay? You can see that there's a much higher incidence of low birth weight babies among blacks. There's a slightly elevated amount among Asians, and what's interesting is Hispanic and white is about the same. In fact, Hispanic is actually slightly lower than for white in terms of the incidence of low birth weight babies. And evidence on prematurity also looks like this. So, an implication is part of the wage gaps we see across racial groups could be traced to what happened during pregnancy. So, can low birth weights be prevented? Believe it or not, the evidence for the effects of income, even marital status, and also even education is mixed, okay? So when I showed you, say, black and Hispanic, average family incomes of black and Hispanics in the US are the same, and yet we see this huge difference in the birth weight gap. Other people who have looked at it don't find a lot of evidence for the income. On marital status, I thought I could give you a nice graph that showed that, but in fact, the percent of babies born to unmarried mothers and Hispanics is above 53%, and yet somehow they're able to get the low birth weight. Education, some people find effects of education, other people don't, so that's more mixed. But mother's behavior really does seem to matter. We have much stronger evidence on that. Numerous studies have shown that cigarette smoking, alcohol consumption, and drug consumption by pregnant mothers decreases birth weight, and prenatal care raises birth weight. Okay, so there's a lot of evidence that the behavior matters. Also, very recent evidence finds that pollution matters. So exposure to carbon monoxide emissions, say if you happen to be unlucky enough to be in your mother's womb when, and you live near a toll plaza where a lot of cars are idling, that's equivalent to having your mother smoke 10 cigarettes a day in terms of the effect on your birth weight. And numerous studies have found that if you take these same areas around a toll plaza, if they switch to electronic tolling so the cars don't have to stop, it dramatically improves the birth weight outcomes of children there. Now, it turns out that black families, black mothers are much more likely to live in high pollution areas, near these toll plazas or near toxic waste dumps. And so we can make a link between what's going on in their environment to what's going on to the birth weight and perhaps to what's going on in terms of wage inequality later. Now, suppose that we're faced with low birth weight babies. Can that effect be mitigated? Well, my colleague Prashant Bharadwaj has a new paper that studies the effects of medical interventions on birth weight using what's called regression discontinuity analysis. So he has very detailed data for both Chile and Norway. Now, it turns out standard medical protocols say that, and this is for very low birth weight babies, that if a baby is below 1,500 grams, then they must go into the neonatal intensive care unit, and they get a lot more medical treatment. If they're above that weight, they typically don't go in, and they show that there's a real difference around those thresholds. So his research strategy is to compare the outcomes of babies just above and just below that threshold. And lo and behold, here's infant mortality relative to birth weight. So you would expect the higher the birth weight, the lower the infant mortality. But what you see is around that threshold, there's a big difference. So a baby who happens to be just above that threshold is more likely to die than a baby below the threshold because they didn't get the extra medical intervention. Now, the infant mortality stuff, isn't necessarily so surprising. What's really surprising is that if you then follow them to 10th grade, the math scores show that same discontinuity. So you would expect math scores to go up as the baby's weight goes up, but there's a discontinuity around that threshold. The babies who didn't get the extra medical intervention end up with lower math test scores in 10th grade. And as we know from Heckman's work, that's going to show up in differences in income. So, the first 9 months really matters too. Yes, preschool matters, but also the first 9 months We know ways to improve birth weight, and we have reason to suspect that that will also improve later outcomes. And the medical interventions can make a difference if a baby does have a low birth weight. So now let me switch to after the first 9 months and more on sort of the years that Professor Heckman is looking at. I'm just going to talk a little bit about family investments of time in children's skill formation. So for the last several years, I've been studying time use a lot. I've been doing historical studies, and something that kept coming up when I was looking at some other issues was that the amount of time that educated parents in the US are spending on their children has skyrocketed since the early 1990s. It went up for less educated parents, but not nearly as much. So a college-educated mother, on average now, spends 8 hours more per week on childcare than she did in 1990. And this was something that my husband and I had sort of observed in our neighborhood, and so we of course had to write a paper about it, and it was called the rugrat race. Now, something that's interesting is that the same phenomenon did not happen in Canada. So everywhere it's the case that more educated mothers spend more time on childcare than less educated mothers. But this dramatic increase that we saw in the US, we actually didn't see in Canada. And in here, we argue that part of the increase in the US is actually linked to the competition to get into colleges here. But that's a little beside the point. But we've been looking at that in more detail. It's beside the point for this particular phase. And we actually argued there that there could be too much investment by the higher educated parents. But I've also recently become interested in test score gaps between different groups, okay? And in particular, Asian and white. Why is this? Well, I'm a professor at the University of California, San Diego. California has about 14%, so 1/4, of high school graduates in California are Asian. At Berkeley, UCLA, and UCSD, about 50% of the students are Asian. So we say, geez, why are there so many Asians in our universities? So I started looking at test scores in the California public schools. And I'm going to show you a graph, and just to make it more comparable, I'm going to show you it for disadvantaged kids, and I've put controls in there, so I'm showing you the within school differences. So this is the test scores across different races for disadvantaged children, and it's within school differences, and it's in California. California is useful because we can actually get a decent sample size of Asians, since 1/3 of all Asian Americans live in California. So the first bar is Asian, the second one is black, the third one is Hispanic, and the fourth one is white. Now, most of the literature has focused on, say, the white-black test score gap, and you can see that that's quite big, same with white-Hispanic. Very few people have looked at the Asian-white test score gap, which is just as big as the other one. Now, even if we care more about the other one, I think we can learn something by looking at the Asian-white test score gap as well. And so that's on research that I'm embarking on. So why are Asian test scores so high? So one thing I wondered is, in talking to my students, is they might lie in how Asian families spend their time. So I went to the time use studies to look at how students spend their time and how parents. Now, to get enough Asians in the sample, I have to use this nationally represented data, but they only start at age 15. So I'm just going to show you high school here. I'm trying to look for other data sources. This is the time spent doing homework by high school students. First one's Asian, black, Hispanic, white. This is averaged over the entire year. On average, Asians are spending almost, say, 12, 13 hours per week. Whites are spending a little bit over 5 hours per week, and then Hispanic and black even less. Now, we have evidence that studying more actually leads to higher test scores. So part of the test score gap, can just be how these students are spending their time. So seeing this, and then with the Tiger Mother book that came out, I don't know if all of you followed that, I said, how does it, because I know it's hard for me, the amount of time we spend on our kids. I said, how does a Yale law professor find all that time to spend on her children and be a Tiger Mother? So I got interested in how Asian parents spend their time relative to other, So do they spend more time on childcare? What have I hit? There, okay, good. So I don't have much time, but basically what I found is Asian mothers don't spend any more time on childcare than white mothers. They spend about 30 minutes more per week on childcare on educational childcare, so helping with homework, reading, but 30 minutes a week isn't that much. I find similar things for fathers. The Asian fathers aren't even spending as much time as the white fathers. So the question is, how are they getting these kids to do all this homework? Well, I think part of it is what they're doing with that time that they are spending with the kids, is that they are instilling values, and we know the stereotype about Asian culture is that they really instill the value of education. And so somehow, without spending any extra time on their own part, they're able to get their kids to do all that extra homework. But something else is I'm starting to look at is sort of the extended family. It's a little bit hard given the data, and I started doing this because I was giving a talk on these issues to a senior citizens group, and they said, well, what about grandparents? So I don't know exactly who's a grandparent, but I can at least look at people over 60. Now the problem is that because of differences in fertility rates, the number of grandchildren each type has is different, so there's some caveats here. But I found the very surprising thing that Asian and Hispanic women over 60 are spending a lot more time with their grandchildren than white women who are spending hardly any time. Black women are spending more time with grandchildren than white women. And part of this is probably the fact that the white families, the grandparents are more likely to live somewhere else or not in the same house. And something we should think about is, having to live in the same house might actually have a benefit for the children because the grandparents are also investing in it. And I also find that for the men. So Asian grandparents are really spending a lot of time with their grandchildren, and same with the Hispanic quite a bit. So to summarize, Professor Heckman's research just opened our eyes to the importance of early childhood in forming skills. He's shown you a lot of evidence about the importance of preschool in terms of cognitive and non-cognitive skills. I've just taken that back a few months and looked at the potential importance for prenatal and neonatal investments. And I've also shown some heuristic evidence on differences in family inputs and test scores across groups. Thanks.